Thank you for joining us today for a podcast brought to you by the Nevada Money Mentors team. My name is Dalia. I'm currently a financial planning peer mentor, and I will be your host. Today, we're joined with David Helene, who is the CEO and founder of Edquity, an app that brings emergency aid and resources to college students. Thank you so much for being here today, David.
Thank you, Dalia. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so we'll move into our first question of the day. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? So things like your background, your education, your experience.
Sure. So I graduated from Yale University in 2012, not entirely sure what I wanted to do with my life. But I found myself starting my career at an interesting organization that was involved both with bank advocacy and payments. So what that meant was we were representing some of the largest banks in the country around sort of regulatory issues related to capital and liquidity regulations, as well as the implications of moving money. It was very interesting, wonky technical work, but I found myself not connected so much to the mission and wanting to advocate for those who had been disenfranchised by those institutions from a financial standpoint. So I became really interested in initiatives related to the unbanked or the underbanked, wanted to think through intergenerational wealth building. And at the time, the sort of student debt crisis was just beginning to really get talked about as one of the biggest financial issues that the country was facing. So as I was thinking about the problem and sort of how I wanted to support younger, I wanted to identify an intervention point that was experiential in nature. So thinking about high school age students, thinking about students who were perhaps cash poor, credit poor, didn't have access to financial services, I started thinking through how I could create a program that focused and centered the implication of matriculating to college on a student's lifetime sort of financial outlook. So I started moonlighting, and in my spare time on my nights and weekends, I started a nonprofit organization with two friends of mine that was focused on the intersection of college financial planning and success. So we built a summer and after school program with a 6-week curriculum that effectively helps students begin to think through what the long-term and short-term financial implications of their college decision might look like. I finally left my job in 2015 after running multiple summer programs where I was doing that full time. And as I got more and more into the work, it became really clear to me that so many students across the country face tremendous structural obstacles that almost render their decision upfront moot, right? You can be as responsible as humanly possible when it comes to borrowing decisions and thinking about trying to minimize expenses for college. But in so many instances, students are facing a situation where the cost of living is just so expensive, and the amount of loans or other forms of financial aid that may be available to them simply aren't going to cover it, right? So what ends up happening is we now have a situation where 3 million students, and this was before the crisis, before the pandemic, were dropping out of college every year due to a time-sensitive financial crisis of less than $500. So that sort of framed our approach at Edquity of wanting to streamline access to the right types of resources in times of financial distress, whether that be emergency aid, emergency resources, or ongoing financial planning tools to help students make sure that a small dollar financial issue is not going to be the reason they didn't graduate.
Definitely. We definitely see that a lot in our programs at Nevada Money Mentors when these students run into what you call these smaller financial issues, like under $500. And it kind of, we kind of see like a snowball effect. Like if you can't handle this, then how can you handle tuition? And it just leads to students dropping out, unfortunately. So I think that is awesome that Edquity has focused in on that issue and is working to support students in a way that I don't think many other places are, at least not like you. So that's fantastic. So David, kind of on that note, we're going to move into our next question. How would you personally describe finance, like personal finance, and why do you think it's important?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It's interesting. Personal finance central to all of our socio-emotional and physical health long term, whether it pertains to just meeting our basic needs or our ability to feel fulfilled and feel happy as we move forward. Um, the interesting thing that we found is that fundamental to personal finance is having money in the first place. There's sort of an interesting framework of trying to help, or at least the historical framework around financial literacy is by providing education. We all can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and make sure that we're okay. What we've found and what a lot of the academic research and literature has shown is that, in fact, folks with sometimes the fewest resources are the most resourceful about how to make them last the longest, right? And there is a stigma that students or individuals who don't have money because they're being irresponsible. And we find that that's usually not the case. When I personally think of personal finance, I think about budgeting, which is almost a luxury, right? The ability to look at your finances and try to think about saving, right? Which of course you need the money to save. But for me, as I've been in the space for so long, I think that personal finance is more about thinking about longer term milestones when you have the luxury of having that money in the first place, right? So thinking about some of those interesting topics like, investing, or thinking about how to put aside extra savings to hit longer term financial goals, or thinking about planning for things like, paying off debt. I mean, these are all very critical things that folks need to understand. But as you think about day-to-day survival, can't do that if you don't have the money and resources you need to be successful in the first place. So for us, being able to meet your basic needs is number one. And often we find that the folks with the fewest resources are the most savvy at doing that. And then after that, folks who have the luxury of having some extra savings, thinking about how to be strategic about that and make that last a little bit longer. So that's sort of how we conceptualize personal finance and Edquity.
Gotcha. Yeah, you definitely hit on a lot of great topics. So it all kind of starts off with your basic needs, right? And what would you say those basic needs are that Edquity helps out with?
Yeah, so it's really the basics, things like food, shelter, childcare, transportation, the types of things that, are central to our day-to-day living, and our ability to do the things that are aspirational, right? Like engage in education. So Edquity is here to try to ensure that students have the resources on hand to meet those basic needs, whether it be providing emergency aid, which we do in partnership with colleges all across the country, or helping students identify resources in the local community that might be sort of standing up any that may be experienced in an individual's life, right? So, helping refer students to things like food pantries in a community, or Salvation Armies, or VITA centers for tax preparation, and these sorts of things that can really help individuals meet some of these financial challenges. One of the things that we're doing more of now as we continue to grow is helping think through how we can get folks enrolled in relevant benefits programs. One of the things that I'm sure many students don't know is that under the Biden administration, the requirements for SNAP have been made less strenuous for students. Some of the work requirement restrictions and other things have been lifted. So it means that more college students now qualify for programs like SNAP and food assistance overnight. So those are the types of things that we at Edquity are trying to help students sort of access and meet, is those types of basic needs.
For sure. Yeah, it's so important to have kind of your foundation first before you even move on to anything else financially or like aspirations wise. And that's awesome. So, kind of moving on to our next question, we're going to take a look at Edquity in a little bit more specifics. So, David, would you mind sharing with us the story of how Edquity began? So, kind of in your answer, also describe what is Edquity, how does it work? I know we touched on some of those things already, but basically, how did Edquity begin?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Edquity has been around for 4 years. We've done a lot of work in that time, both in the K-12 and college space. So it actually began as trying to automate some of the financial planning sort of work that we were encountering at the nonprofit to try to make it easier for students to engage in some of those decisions. Over time, as we again became more familiar with some of the macroeconomic realities that students were facing, we started that framework to the college context and a focus on documenting and streamlining access to resources in students' communities, which now includes emergency aid. So we went through what they call in startup land is a pivot, and we pivoted and really focused on our post-secondary product. And that product started with a resource referral section. So we have what we call sort of our Yelp for emergency resources. So students can identify, again, these local community supports that may be able to help them in times of need, as well as a budgeting tool to help students around ongoing personal finance and to make sure that they were able to really track and monitor their expenses. As we've evolved, we've layered on emergency aid into that. So wanting to be able to actually administer on behalf of colleges and universities these emergency cash assistance programs. And I will say, right now in the wake of the pandemic, every college and university in the country has an emergency 3 stimulus, all of which have included carve-outs for emergency aid for students. So from any students who may be in distress or listening, it is worth reaching out to a financial aid office to see if the HERF2, which is the second stimulus bill, if that allocation is available. And most colleges and universities will be giving out HERF3 funds for the next couple of years, starting likely in the summer or fall. So it's something I want to put on students' radars is that even at schools that Edquity is not serving, those funds are likely available in some form. But we now are an app that takes on the brand of our partner, where students can apply for emergency aid at that partner and can also access these local resources and engage in our budgeting tool. So that is sort of how Edquity works and how we operate in conjunction with partners.
Perfect. So I've actually downloaded Edquity and taken a look at some of these things that you're talking about, kind of like the Yelp page with all the resources, and it's super helpful. Like if students are ever hungry, you can just click on the food tab and it shows you all of the food resources in the area, like pack provisions at UNR, or there's also all those budgeting tools in there as well. It's super helpful just having everything in one spot. So that's so cool. Our next question. So again, we kind of have touched on this, but let's dive into a little bit more specifics. So there's many college students out like in the US right now who are receiving financial aid in one form or another, either from the universities or the federal government. So specifically, how does Edquity fit into this entire financial aid picture?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that Edquity's financial aid before the pandemic was sort of what I would call off the books financial aid. So what I mean by this is that these were predominantly philanthropic programs. Sometimes they were state programs, but by and large, we weren't talking about federal financial aid. So we were sort of helping advancement offices or other parts of the college or university manage these emergency funding programs, and then they would have a small implication on students' financial aid eligibility over time. Today, it's a very different environment. So in the last 12 months, through these 3 stimulus bills, the federal government has made available approximately $32 billion in emergency aid, which is an unprecedented amount of money. It's almost close to what goes out in the Pell Grant every year. So this is not what's called a Title IV program, not to get too technical. It is sort of its special vehicle of federal aid. Our hope is that the federal government will make a new grant program available for students on a going basis that is reserved for emergency aid. So President Biden and his education platform actually promised that he would fight hard for students to make 2 different federal emergency grant programs available. So we hope that we will see that come forth in the future. For those who are watching the confirmation hearing for the nominee for the Undersecretary of Education yesterday, the Senate Chair, Patty Murray, did ask about student basic needs and the importance of emergency aid. So if there were ever a time, now would be that time to see emergency aid made as a steady state as a federal program. And we are optimistic and hopeful that that will be the case, and that as we engage with more institutions and more students over the years, we will be managing an actual federal program.
Fantastic. So you are kind of leading into this next question a little bit, talking about the future. So I actually want to ask you this question next, but what do you think will be the future of financial aid in America?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there are a lot of important dialogues going on around how financial aid needs to change. So one of the top priorities of the Biden administration was to uphold the Pell Grant, right? So the Pell Grant certainly has not kept up with inflation or with the rising cost of living or cost of tuition. So the Biden-Harris administration has talked about doubling it in size, which would be a huge, important moment in the country to start to better adjust what students can receive in financial aid to the actual realities of the costs that they're facing. We've also heard about some of the free college programs. Many states have taken on these free college programs. Many local jurisdictions as well, municipalities have done this. There is reason for optimism that we would see, at least at the 2-year level, free college that is provided for by federal funds. Now, of course, what that means is that it's just covering the cost of tuition, right? And that's, as we know, not the only cost that a student has to pay when they go to college. But we do think that we would see increased investments in federal aid over time. So I do think that we will see structural reforms that will provide for more federal aid for students as it pertains to grant funding, which is what's really needed. And I also think we're going to see a lot of structural change around what types of post-secondary options are available to students, which will also impact the amount of financial aid that they may be receiving. So I think a lot of change is coming. And I think it's coming, with a relatively short time horizon. And there is reason for optimism as a student to be able to receive more grant aid in the future.
Wow, so lots of changes coming. Especially big changes you were mentioning to the structure or to the system. So I think as a student that is very positive, very hopeful for the future, because many of us feel not quite positive about financial aid right now. But I'm glad that there is, hope on the horizon.
Yes, well,
So,
fingers crossed.
oh yes, fingers crossed. So David, we're kind of wrapping up on the Edquity section, but in general, what do you think is the true value or benefit that Edquity provides for students?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So there are a few things that I think we have been providing for students and certainly can get better. But as we think about emergency aid, right, it's not just the dollars that matter, right? It's the how students get those dollars. So historically, before the pandemic, it took about 9 days for students to get an emergency aid grant after they applied for it, right? And for students in be waiting 9 days, you need that money now. That actually has only gotten worse since the pandemic. So in the wake of the federal funding, colleges and universities are not designed to be delivering emergency assistance programs to individuals. And there's a lot of bureaucracy and administrative overhead. And while, so many folks are so well-intentioned in managing these programs, they just don't have the resources to do it. And what we saw after the pandemic is that it's taken about 13 days now to get grants to students. That, of course, is not acceptable. So Edquity, on average, has been able to get funding to students on average in 25 hours after they apply. So really, in a day, we're able to get students, a decision and then their award, so that they are not left in limbo waiting, in a crisis, not having access to the resources that they need. We also at Edquity are really focused on racial equity, right? So there are historical chasms in this country where Black students, Latinx students API students, there have been material intergenerational wealth gaps, and wealth building is not equal. And we always say as a country that post-secondary education is the way to narrow these gaps, right? And if we're not able to narrow equity gaps and persistence rates and graduation rates, and making sure that the types of students who disproportionately struggle with the types of financial issues that induce dropout, if we are not ensuring that emergency aid dollars are going to those students at the same rates that they're experiencing these issues, these programs are not going to have the impact that we want to see. So Edquity is also really focused on narrowing racial equity gaps and how we do awarding. So we've designed our program to honor how applications come in and the types of challenges that students are facing through a racial equity lens. So that's another big piece of our puzzle. Is it's not just getting money out fast, it's doing so equitably. And we've also been able to find that our work is effective. So we work with a college called Compton College, in the LA County region. We found with statistical significance that students that we were able to fund last year graduated at twice the rate as students who were not funded. So we're able to make the material difference in improving retention outcomes for students. And my hope over time is that there's not just an actual retention benefit, but also a socio-emotional one, right? Students are dealing with material financial trauma. Students are feeling significant stigma around basic needs challenges, right? I think a lot of students feel that somehow this is their fault, right? We want to be able to destigmatize a lot of the feelings that students are experiencing in their moment of stress and crisis. And we want to do a better job of creating an experience for students that sees them, that honors them, that starts to create community for them, to make sure that they're not feeling like they're going through their challenges in isolation and silo. That's not just them. That's where we're going as an organization. So I think we have the resources in there, but we need to start building community too. And that's something that I'm excited for us to start doing in the future.
Yeah, that is so wonderful. So, working to help students not only get the aid that they need quickly, but also equitably. And also, by doing that, you're kind of attacking these larger issues of, like inequality, whether it's like racial inequality, socioeconomic inequality. So, it's lots of great things that you are all working on. And I appreciate you sharing all of that about Edquity. So we are moving into some of our concluding questions. David, a lot of our listeners who listen to our podcast are college students. They're undergraduate students who are maybe having a tough time financially one way or another. And, our base is very similar to your base too. We're all trying to work towards the same goals. But do you just have any advice for college students who may be listening?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a few pieces of advice I would have. I mean, first and foremost is resources do exist, right? So if you haven't looked into an emergency aid program at your institution, please do. Whether it's HERF 2, which is the second stimulus, or upcoming HERF 3, try to find out how you might be able to access those funds. Beyond that, many colleges have been doing wonderful jobs of re-engineering themselves as social services agencies. It's not what they're supposed to be, but there are heroes on both 2 and 4 year college campuses across the country that are setting up mobile food banks and other sorts of mental health programs, and those resources may be available. And definitely reach out to your student affairs professionals to figure out what may be around and may be able to be a resource to you. I would remind you that you're not alone, that so many college students are dealing with crisis right now, and it's not your fault. And it's important to remember that. This is as difficult a moment as possible to be a college student with a pandemic, with so many racially motivated acts of violence, with a lot of political polarization. It's a very difficult time to be a college student. So give yourself a break and remember that it's not your fault. And then I think the last thing I would say is college students are a tremendous force for change. We have seen a lot of remarkable examples of leadership, of political transformation that have been driven by college students. And I'll point to a couple of recent examples. A friend of mine in California, Rachel Sumac, started an amazing organization when she was in college called Swipe Out Hunger. And Swipe Out Hunger is, it has started available meal swipes for students to try to address the issue of food insecurity. And what they've been able to do as an organization is, I think they've now been responsible for multiple states. I think it's up to 3 or 4 states now, starting in California. I think it's Maryland and Minnesota, I want to say, have passed these bills, these hunger-free campus bills that have appropriated additional state funds to combat food insecurity on college campuses. So that was all the activism and work and hard work of college students. There's an organization in LA called RISE, which has been doing tremendous advocacy around issues of free tuition. Around the last election, they also did a lot of voter registration work and a lot of student mobilization work. So, there was so much tremendous good that has come out of the actions of college students. And if you feel motivated or like there's injustice, your voice matters, your actions matter, and you have the ability to enact real change, like so many college students who have come before you. So I would say, go out and be the change that you want to see, because you really have a lot of power.
Yeah, I think that's really lovely. And many of our listeners are going to appreciate that advice. What you started off by saying that, we're all going through a tough time right now and it's not our fault. And sometimes it really is just good to hear that. But then also, the whole world is going through a great time of change right now. And this is kind of like the perfect time that if we want to go start an initiative, or if we see something that needs to be changed, that we have the power to do so. And so that is awesome. And I'm glad that you recognize that and want to share that with students. All right, David. So we are moving on to our final question of today. Do you have any closing remarks or final thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah. I mean, a big call to action on my previous answer, but I would just remind folks that take it one day at a time, right? Things are not going to change overnight, and it's a very difficult slog. And again, give yourself a break. I think now more than ever, I think they're the 2 most common difficulties that college students are facing are financial pressure and mental health challenges. And those, of course, are inextricably linked and they go hand in hand. But because of that, students need to engage in self-care. They need to acknowledge what their limits are, right, and try to give themselves a break. But again, I'll reiterate that there are people who care about you, right? There are people on college campuses that care about you. There's so many wonderful student affairs professionals, financial aid administrators too, who really do want to see students be successful. So you're not doing this alone. And there are also really interesting communities that have been popping up on campuses across the country. Actually, UNR was, I think, the 3rd or 4th school to create what's called a How to Be Not Rich guide. So these are crowdsourced student created guides that are really oriented toward low and middle income students who are dealing with financial difficulty. They're for students, by students, and UNR has their own guide, right? So this is a 75-page thing that is a way to find community. It's a way to find tips and tricks. So again, there are supports, there are folks out there who can be helpful. And I would just want to continue to reiterate that during this very difficult time of isolation, alienation, all of the difficulties, just want to remind folks that there are other people out there who care.
For sure. So when times are tough, pandemic or not, you have resources, you have people who want to support you and who care for you. And one of them, of course, one of the resources being Edquity. So David, if students are interested in downloading Edquity and want to check it out, how can they go about doing that?
Yeah, so Edquity is available on both the App Store and Google Play under the name Edquity, EDQUITY, or folks can visit our website at edquity.co, not .com, but .co. If you type Edquity into Google, it'll also be the first thing that pops up.
Lovely. And besides Edquity, students at UNR also have Nevada Money Mentors, which is a free on-campus program. We are currently working online. So if you want to schedule an appointment online to meet one-on-one with a financial peer mentor, they can also walk you through some of these things, like the basics of finances, to help you get back on your feet. So David, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was amazing to hear about Edquity, how it can help students, what kind of path this company is on right now, and how it all fits into the big picture. So it was really amazing being able to talk with you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dahlia. Have a good one.